Today my guest is Eugene McCague, Chairman of the Board of Appian Asset Management. Eugene joined the board of Appian in September 2017, following his retirement as a partner in Arthur Cox, one of Ireland's leading law firms. He has over 35 years' experience as a corporate lawyer. He served as both managing partner and chairman of Arthur Cox. He's been involved as a non-executive director of public and private commercial companies, state boards, and not-for-profit companies. He was president of Dublin Chamber of Commerce and the chair of the governing authority of University College Dublin. Eugene, you're very welcome to the show today.
Thank you, James. Lovely to be here.
Great. Well, what I normally start with any guest, and for the listeners, would you like to share an overview of your career to date, your varied career to date? Maybe talk about some of the highs and lows. What are you most proud of?
Okay, well, maybe a little bit of background on myself. I come from Clonus, County Monaghan. I went to school there and did my leaving cert in St. McCartney's College in Monaghan. I got 1A, 2 Bs and 3 Cs, which in 1975 was enough to get you into any course in any university in Ireland. And now wouldn't get you into the lowest course in the lowest of colleges. And I decided to do law. And the main reason I think I decided to do law was that my mother would have liked me to be a dentist, but I was very squeamish, so I didn't fancy that. And my mother had worked as a conveyancing clerk in a local solicitor's office, and I'd often gone up after work to her offices. My father died when I was very young, and I used to go up after school, I should say, to her. And something about the old Dickensian building she worked in and the old deeds attracted me. The only thing that attracted me to law was in UCD in those days, it was 8 hours lectures a week. And I thought that sounded kind of a suitable amount of work for a fellow like me. So that was it. I headed off to UCD, did my degree in UCD. Then I needed to find myself an apprenticeship. I could have done, in those days, if you were doing a law degree, you ended up being a solicitor or a barrister. You didn't really look at broader horizons, which you do nowadays. And the general view was if you had no family connections, there was no point in going into the bar. So you become a solicitor. So I looked for an apprenticeship, and I was interviewed by the firm of McCann, Fitzgerald, Roach and Dudley. I got an interview. There were 4 applicants for 4 places. So even I managed to get myself through that. I had not a very good degree from UCD, but I certainly enjoyed my time there. And interesting for those of anyone listening to this who's in the legal business now, McCann Fitzgerald, as it now is, was by a long way the largest firm in the country at the time, by a very long way. And it had 40 solicitors, and it was known as the factory because it was seen as so big. And nowadays, of course, firms of 300, 350, 400 lawyers. So, but I was very fortunate to get an apprenticeship there, and it was wonderful. It was great fun. It was, we were very well trained in a kind of, but thrown in at the deep end, and you had to do anything you were asked to do, and that included, on one occasion, being asked by one partner to go out and remove a mouse from a mousetrap in her house. I had to go and buy thermal underwear for an elderly client whose will was being made, and a variety of other things. And you got a very broad experience, let's put it that way. But the issue was I qualified in 1982, and for the historians out there, the 1980s was a grim time from an economic point of view, and there were very, very few jobs. And a lot of my contemporaries headed off to England, basically. But I've been very fortunate that during my apprenticeship, I worked in the insolvency department in McCann's, and the people in there liked me. And so I was offered a job in insolvency, which was in the 1980s the place to be. And I spent a couple of years in McCann's working on insolvencies, going down to factories with the liquidators and seeing people made redundant, which is, I was 23 or 4 at the time. It was a pretty sobering experience and made you, I think, realize how fortunate you were. And I worked there for a couple of years. Then I got attracted to join a small firm. And I joined a small firm called Esmond Riley & Co., which only had 4 lawyers at the time, but was kind of niche and specializing in insolvency and banking. And I enjoyed that, but I kind of missed the big work because the bigger firms get the bigger work. So I left there in 1987 and I joined Arthur Cox, and I remained in Arthur Cox for the next 30 years. So that's the whistle stop. I can tell you some more about it, but that's the overview.
Wow, that's a fascinating story about the insolvency, because I would be of the view that, and it's a tough world, because we see companies that might explode, and you're coming in after. It's what you learn about business, though. You learn about people. Do you want to share what you learned as a young 23, 24-year-old, besides the legal and the kind of the professional skills? What about the human skills?
Well, I think I learned at that time that that most people whose businesses failed, in some cases it was because of bad management, but by and large it was because of bad luck, and because technology was changing. Some of the companies that went into liquidation in those days were companies in old style textile, in old style manufacturing, and you also realized, because there were no other jobs around. So if somebody was losing their job after 20 or 30 years, that was going to be it for them in the 1980s. I remember being involved in a company called Keenan's of Bagnallstown, which is an engineering company. And there was a man who I met, and he was 30 years working there, and he was only 50. 50 seemed old to me at the time, but I now realize it's very young. And he knew, or believed anyway, and I think I was probably right, that he was never going to get another job. So I learned probably on one level how lucky I am, how lucky I was. But I also learned that as things got a little bit better, that failure, that it wasn't a question of failure. There was a bit of a stigma at the time of companies going insolvent, whereas in the United States it's always been almost a badge of honor to be bankrupt. I mean, you can have presidents who be bankrupt 3 times, and that's the way it goes. So, it was a very interesting area. I think the other thing purely from a practice point of view was it was very broad. You did a bit of the commercial stuff, you did the lease on the property, you did the litigation, you sued the people who owed money. So it was very, very, very good training for later on.
That's great. And then you moved, obviously, the latter into the corporate side, and then to be managing partner of Arthur Cox. What's that transition like? Because for X amount of years, the legal game is run a particular way, and you run off clients, you get more clients, you run off clients, and suddenly now you're into managing with not a lot of experience. Maybe I'm incorrect, of that type of a job where you're not practicing, you become that kind of overall manager or leader of the firm.
Well, you've virtually no experience, the truth, and I think certainly in legal firms, and I'm not commenting on all the managing partners who've come since me in all the firms, but I speak about myself. But the reality is, first of all, you're elected to the role as opposed to appointed. So they don't necessarily say who is the best. Well, they try to say who is the best person. But ironically, invariably it's somebody who's done reasonably well in their legal career, who's developed good relationships with important clients. And while all that's doing, you then take them out of that for 4 years and you ask them to run a business, of which they have no experience. And you certainly give, in those days, we were given very little training on it. So you end up also moving from a situation where all of these people were your peers and your equals, to the extent you're first among equals, and you have to make hard decisions about partners, in many cases, who are older and a lot more experienced than you. So it was a difficult transition, very difficult.
What did you learn? If you were to go back to yourself, what training would you have taken coming out of it or starting it? Just what might you have needed?
I think I would have, at the start of it, I think even some basic business courses would have been helpful to understand. I'm not talking necessarily about Harvard or anywhere, but just some business course. I think, and something I've become interested in latter years, and which I've some involvement, is coaching. I think I would have liked, looking back, to have somebody coaching me or even somebody mentoring me. You suddenly go to being in a rather lonely position where you're the, in inverted commas, boss, although you're not really. So I think preparing people for it and grooming them and making sure that they have some management training and so on before they get the job. Even nowadays, it seems to me still that people get the job and then start going up to find out how to do it.
And in the ingredients of the job, what was the bit you liked the best, or what did you like the best in the job?
Oh, well, the best bit about being the managing partner was promoting new partners, without a doubt, bringing people through and seeing them come through. That was by far the best bit. The actual administration and the financial end of it and the dealing with problems and so on were not very attractive. So the best bit is actually to see the business growing. And I was managing partner Arthur Cox from 1999 to 2003. And I was fortunate, that was a growth time. That was the Celtic Tiger years. So even if I did nothing, the firm was going to grow anyway. And recruiting people, I recruited about 12 lawyers from Australia during that time. All of them were excellent because there was nothing here. They were all recruited sight unseen.
Wow. And so actually, so what do you look from people, from your trainee right up to kind of the more experienced lawyers? What's your approach to it?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is what you don't look for is you don't look for the finished product. So you don't look at trainees and say, I can see this person as a future managing partner, or I can see this person as a senior corporate partner. You may say that, you may slightly think it, but you have to realize that people are going to develop at different paces and come along in different ways and so on. I think what you look for, particularly in the professional world, is, if I could put it very simply, does this person get it? Does he or she get it? Do they really have do they have a kind of a sense of what it's all about? Do they understand that it's quite a pressurized job and that they're going to be working very hard? Will they be capable of working in a team? Will they be capable of taking direction? Will they be able to make decisions and give advice? So you're looking for somebody who do you think they have empathy? I know it's a cliche, it's every business is a people's business, but it is. So particularly if you're in one of the larger firms, legal excellence or legal ability is almost taken for granted. You have to have that. But on top of that, I think really do they understand they get it? And you, as you know, James, better than I do, there's only so much you can get from an interview. So you do end up taking a chance on people.
And is that a gut, or is that experienced, or a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think, put it this way, I think if you can't relate to the person at the interview, and if you can't imagine yourself working with them, I used to have this test in my head. If you at 8:00 on a wintry November evening and you're stuck in the office with James Fitzsimons and you're saying to yourself, how in God's name do we ever recruit this guy? So you kind of have to look at that. It's gut, but also it's experience. I mean, you begin to see different traits in people.
It's funny. That's interesting that the company Stripe, which is very, very successful, they have a very exhaustive interview process. But one of the tick the box is, do I want to work with this person on a Saturday if I have to come into work?
Yeah, but I mean that's
one of their criteria. And if you think about it, that's a really, really smart, very simple question, but very smart.
Or if you're thinking of a client, you're saying, would I be willing to leave the room and take another call and leave this young person in the room with Joe Bloggs or whatever? Do I trust them from that point of view? Not that they're going to do anything wrong, but it is a bit of gut and experience.
And going back to that last point, I was actually you're intuitive there. That 22-year-old. So what if I understand and I've heard someone else say this before, that maybe newly qualified in the office, you're running that meeting, you've got to step out. It's that their ability to say to that client at a human level, just to make them feel comfortable. They're not talking law to them. They're just, and they come back in and someone says, that's a really good professional. You can be talking about the football, or is that the kind of or emotional intelligence is the word they use, but that kind of wide human skills.
It is, yeah, because I think sometimes young lawyers make the mistake of thinking that their clients actually have the same love of the law that they have. And that is simply not the case. Clients want solutions and they want answers. And I used to have a simple thing. I used to say to some young, I had a rule with young lawyers that if I asked them to do a bit of research for me, I'd ask them back and tell me what the answer was, not to do me a memo. And I would say, I could honestly say if I took 100 cases, I'd say 5 out of the 100 ever did what I asked. And the others still had to go back because they're out of college. They had to do a memo because they wanted to impress the more senior person. And they'd have footnotes and cases and so on. And I tried to explain to them that the client doesn't really care whether it was Lord Wilberforce or Lord Williams or anybody else said this. And he doesn't really care that in most cases that is subsection 2B of the Act. And he certainly doesn't want to be quoted the entire Act and told to go and find it. And I think a lot of it is trying to explain to young lawyers, that are, some of them love showing off a little bit. That isn't what clients are interested in. Clients are interested, they have a problem and they want it solved, usually, or they have an opportunity and they want it fulfilled. And it's your job to do it. And precisely how you get there is not what they're interested in. It's getting there.
And they want to trust you that you kind of got their back.
Yeah, and you do find with people too that there is a certain category of lawyers. I'm going to say young lawyers. That's untrue because some of them keep it throughout their careers, who take pleasure in finding a problem. You say, "Oh, hooray! Look at me, I'm very bright." No, you have to identify the problems, but you identify them, but you have to present them with a solution if you can.
That's really interesting. And now you moved out of practice and you're now chairman of Appian Asset Management, and there's good news. Do you want to share? There's good news there recently that I read.
Yeah, Appian is a small asset management company, as you know, James, and very well regarded, very well run, but very difficult to grow businesses of that scale organically. And it has just been announced before Christmas that, subject to central bank approval, so I have to put in that caveat, that a company called Gresham Group in the UK is taking it over. And I think it's a great fix. They're very much into the green agenda and ethical funds and investing in things like forestry and innovative farming techniques. And they're going to bring a whole new opportunity to Appian. And culturally, I think it's going to be a very good fit. So no, it's great for the people involved in it.
It sounds like a great partnership. And your other project work now, you're INED in a few boards. You're involved in some not-for-profits, and then you work with do some work for UCD. Do you want to share just kind of the potpourri of that?
Yeah, well, I'm finishing UCD now. I was chairman of the governing authority for almost 5 years, which I always describe it as, I found it interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say I found it enjoyable, but I found it interesting. I mean, it's got a governing authority of 40 people made up of some local authority people, some staff, some students, some business people. And so the art of chairing a meeting of 40 people is an interesting thing itself. So I learned that. I mean, I made a rule when I retired from Arthur Cox a few years ago. I set myself a target that I'd try as best I could only to do things that I found interesting and only to work with people I liked. Because being honest, if you're going to be in a long professional career, it's not all interesting and you don't like all your clients and you don't even like all your colleagues. So, and by and large, I think I've succeeded in that. And I'm on a number of boards, and I've just recently, on the not-for-profit, I've recently become chair of the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland, which is a wonderful, wonderful charity. And that's going to take up, a reasonable amount of my time.
That's interesting. And just, you mentioned UCD there. Where post-COVID, where do you see third level education with the whole change in the model. Students are at home. The evolved infrastructure may be redundant. Have you any thoughts, or maybe you can share where it might go?
Well, I'm worried. I'd be worried about it. I can say rather selfishly that all of my three children are now through university, but I'm worried about it in the sense that student life is not about studying. I mean, studying is a part of it, but it's really about the experience, and it's about meeting people and getting to know them and developing lifelong friendships and relationships and getting involved in clubs and societies and the whole interaction. And that is obviously gone at the moment, or nearly gone. And I'd be slightly concerned that going forward, remote learning will become more and more a feature of it, and that will be taken away. And I think if you're going to, you're very young when you go, and it's a fundamental part of developing as a person. And college, if you're fortunate enough to have been to college, and if you're fortunate enough to be in college, as I was at the time when it was all hands-on, is a hugely important part of it. So I'd be worried about from that point of view. Also, culturally, UCD has something, I think it's about 25% of the students are foreign. And that's a huge cultural mix, which is great, which will be lost if most of the meetings or lectures are on Zoom or the like. So I'd be concerned for it.
Interesting. If you didn't, if you didn't become a lawyer, if you look back, is there a kind of dream job you would have liked? I mean, play football for Man United, or become a professional golfer, or become an orator, or I'm just curious, is there any kind of job you'd say, yeah, that's me?
I don't know whether I have a dream job. I think the job I would have done if I had become a lawyer is I would have really liked to, is I'd like to have studied history, in particular Irish history, and I think I'd like to be a university professor, and I'd be the German Ferrisher type. Irish history is a hobby, so I think I would have liked that. I mean, I think like all young boys, you go through the playing for Man United phase and so on, but it became fairly self-evident, even to somebody like myself, that wasn't going to happen. No, I think if I'd done anything else within my capabilities, that's what I'd like to have done.
That would be my daughter did history in Trinity, and she loved it. And they had a fabulous, and she's very, very lucky to do. She did a fabulous, inclusive academic team that brought the young students in and made them equals and fostered that debate. And so it was a great experience. And I suppose history repeats itself. So I would have a view maybe that people shouldn't maybe, or well, let me phrase it. So if you go into those defined, the legal or the medical or kind of more defined education, that you may miss kind of a wider education, that whether you might do a year of something, a bit of philosophy, a bit of history, maybe a bit of a language, a bit of mathematics, so you'd come out maybe slightly, and then maybe specialize. It's something that I've always thought that might be useful for younger people, in a sense. The question about networking, and particularly in COVID, I take it in the job at that 23-year-old, you were going out on those insolvency projects, you start to meet people from different professions, different companies, different firms. What was your approach? How did you understand networking at 23, maybe 33, and then you became a partner and a managing partner? How did that work for you?
At 23, I understood networking as going out drinking, and that remained basically true until I retired. Not quite. No, I think networking is, I think it's a phrase that puts some people off, because I think people define themselves, I'm a good at networking, or I'm bad at networking. Networking, there's nothing more. Networking is about meeting people. Making contacts is the next bit, and getting business from those people or working with them is the next bit. But it's fundamentally about meeting people and getting to know them. And I learned, I worked for a man in McCampus many years ago, Michael Williams, he was very, very good to me. It's still alive, thankfully. But Michael had a very old-fashioned Rolodex of contacts. and he had a wonderful secretary at the time. And she would have in details, and she would have, if he was going out to lunch with James Fitzsimons, she'd pull a little card out, and it would have James Fitzsimons, and it would say interest, tennis and rugby. It would name his wife. It would give the names and the ages of the children. It might even say that he prefers Chablis to Sancerre. I don't know what exactly it said. But, nowadays with all the CRM management programs on, but he used to have that, and he was brilliant at it. And you'd hear him saying, so, James, how is your daughter, Rachel? And I hear she's working as a lawyer and so on. So I learned quite early on that the trick, I hate to use the word the trick, but it's actually to get to know the person in their entirety, get to know them, get to know their interests, get to know about their family and so on. And it's not about, it's about developing a profile for yourself, but it's not about getting work. The getting the work comes as a consequence of getting to know the person. It doesn't go the other way. And you sometimes see these ham-fisted, I remember, you see people saying, oh, we must get together and do some, I'd love to do some business with you, or we must do this. In my experience, it doesn't work. It didn't work. In most cases, it was you got to know them. In many cases, if you got to know their spouse and maybe you went out with them, and let's say if it was a man who was the client, the wife might say, well, that fellow Eugene seems a nice man, and his wife seems very nice. And bit by bit, one of the biggest cases I ever got near the end of my career, I got from a guy who I'd known for 14 years who had never given me work in between. Now, I hadn't been pounding his door for 14 years looking for work, but ultimately he got to a stage where he had quite a big transaction, and he said, now, who do I know? Who would I trust? Who would I like to look after me on this? And it happened to be me. So I think it's hugely important, but I don't think people going networking should put a balance sheet on it. It's not if you're understanding the point I'm trying to make, it's not about bam, bam. I've known James Simons for 6 months and he still hasn't given me a case. I'll now move on to John Fitzsimons and see, will he give me something?
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I mean, my own style has always been, I actually do enjoy meeting people. And if you can listen, it's amazing, and make people comfortable appropriately. What people can share with you, it can be really interesting. Really, hobbies are, and it's not about work, because I think people buy people, and people buy trust. I'm curious how this will work after COVID if we're all on screens. So I'm not sure, a bit confused about that. I'm just not sure. Some of it's easier, but then you don't have that energy feeling that when you meet somebody, you say, God, I love the energy of this person, or they make me smile. Even the human thing of making somebody smile, where somebody doesn't, or tell them a funny story, or empathize with them, or listen to them maybe.
Well, I think even before COVID, if I could just say, I think social media in my view, hasn't been great for networking. It's great, and I appreciate people, particularly in your line of work, there are huge advantages, say, like LinkedIn as one medium, and it is very good in the sense that you can find out information about people. But the fact that somebody asks you to join them on LinkedIn doesn't mean they know you, or doesn't mean that you know them or anything really about them other than what's written down there. And I think it has become a kind of a shield behind which some people hide. It's a bit like kids saying, I have 350 friends on Facebook. They're not friends in the sense of the word that I would use. I mean, I'm friendly with an awful lot of people, but have I half a dozen friends, by how I define it. Yeah. So, and I think it's the same with networking, that there's a danger if you go to an event like the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. I was privileged to be president of it a number of years ago, and it's a great organisation. But realistically, there's 1,600 at the dinner, and you meet a load of people, and you hand out a load of business cards. That is networking, but if you want to move from networking to developing business relationships, that's all about trust, and it's all about the long game. It really is.
It's interesting. Switching the tempo. I mean, the job you've been in and the job you finished, it was a very stressful job. Have you any thoughts around workplace stress? Because being a lawyer, I know a little bit about it. My brother was a lawyer, as you would know, and my daughter's a lawyer. You're on the click of the clients that when they want you have to jump. I mean that not literally. So how did you manage your stress? And there's good and bad stress, by the way.
Yeah, could I answer it slightly differently? I think stressful is, the word I definitely use about it is relentless, which is a slightly different word. And I use relentless, and obviously more particularly now with email and mobile phone. I mean, I was fortunate that in my first 20 years of practice, I didn't have to worry about emails or just about mobile phones. It had its own stresses and relentless, not having been able to keep in contact and so on. I think different people cope with stress differently. I had a mentor who used to remind me that, that we're insured. He said, don't be afraid of this. You're going to start on the principle you're going to make mistakes, that most of the mistakes you make have actually very little consequence. And for the very, very, very rare ones that'll have a consequence, there's always insurance. He was very kind of pragmatic about it. I think in dealing with stress, first of all, it depends on your own circumstances, your family circumstances, whether you have a release, whether you have something to go to, golf, whatever. I think one of the things that young lawyers make a bad mistake on is that they imagine that they can't say no. So they take on more and more work. They start cancelling events. They decide that I can't go home for Easter to see my family because I'm going to be working on this case, or I can't go home in the evening. A lot of people, they book into a yoga class every Wednesday evening at 7:00, and after about 2 classes they just stop it because they say, I can't do that, I won't get there. They never actually ask anyone, can there, or they don't build the rest of the world around it. So it becomes a self-fulfilling thing. And I used to find with people, I had this thing about people working at weekends, that what would happen is that about 1:00 on a Friday, you suddenly say, I'm never going to get this all done today. I'm going to be working all weekend. And so all that kind of anticipating stress is a very bad thing. I learned something in my later life, and possibly too late to deal with it, but it's a phrase that executive coaches sometimes use, which is, what is the worst that can happen? I think it's a great question. I think it's a very good question to ask yourself in any particular sense. What is the worst that can happen here? And it might be you're going to lose the client. It might be serious, but it might be simply that someone's going to be delayed, or you're going to have to make a difficult phone call, or the perfection that you normally like is going to have to give way to a little bit more practical answer. So if you could try and ask yourself, what is the worst that can happen here? Where is this relative to the other people under other jobs and so on? It's not easy, but I do think my late father-in-law said when I was a very young lawyer and I was under what I thought was terrible stress, and I was complaining about all the work I had to do and so on. And he said to me, look, forget it. He said, if you can't handle the stress, why don't you become a hairdresser? Now, why he decided hairdressing was unstressful, I don't know, but it kind of put me back in my box,
Okay. That's interesting. So learn to say no. No, I can't do that, but I can do it by Wednesday.
Yeah. I mean, you've led me into a subject I do like, which is how to deal things like that. One of the things is creating false deadlines and creating deadlines for yourself. And I give a few talks in Arthur Cox, particularly in my latter years. And one of the things I used to say to them is, always ask the client, when do you need this? Not when would you like this, when do you want it, like when do you need this? And invariably, if you ask the question, they'd say, well, I have a board meeting on next Thursday, so if you could have it to me by Monday, that'd be great. If you don't ask the question, then you go away and what you say is, you say, okay, I look at that this evening, I'll have that to you this evening. And then you don't have it this evening. And then the following day, you've put yourself under terrible stress. And the client is now disappointed in you because I was waiting for that, it hasn't arrived. So always ask. Don't be afraid to say, when do you need this? And don't be afraid to say, I won't be able, unfortunately, I will not be able to get to that on Friday. Will Monday be okay? It's absolutely fine. People don't say it. They just leave the phone, and particularly in the modern world with emails and so on. There are people who think that because they've sent you an email, that of itself means they're going to get an immediate response. So planning yourself and being honest about we're all human,
That's a great bit of advice. Such a simple Bit of
Just
advice.
ask them, when do you need this? Most people, now, I mean, there were some, I mean, and also, you know, there are people who would want something on the Friday evening of a long weekend. And you knew, as I knew, they weren't going to read it. You knew they weren't going to read it. So it's just better off to say to them, there's a long weekend coming up, so I assume you won't want to read it. You won't look at this stuff, but if I have it in Tuesday morning, would that be all right? Or I have it in Wednesday morning.
Yeah, really interesting. My last question, Eugene, 5 words to describe your career.
5 words to describe my career. Fortunate, interesting, stimulating, relentless, and at times, those 3 words, but at times terrifying.
Okay, that's great. Eugene, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share your story and experiences on the Career Scoop. Thank you very much, Eugene.
Thanks, James. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Career Scoop, brought to you by Elevate Career Advice and Elevate Executive Selection, Dublin and Bermuda. I'm James Fitzsimons, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. Bye.